Dylan Benson was, and always was, the stereotypical scaredy cat. So much so that he was even born with his tiny little hands clinging to the umbilical cord, as if he was too afraid of the world, hoping the cord would pull him back inside the womb. As he grew older, his fears, of course, developed. He was the target of all of his friends' pranks. He couldn't even stand to go to the cemetery when his parents put flowers on relatives' graves for the holidays, and he slept in his parents' bedroom until he was 12. Like most people who aren't brave, night times were the worst. When trying to fall asleep, you're laying comfortably in bed, body spread out and vulnerable. Because you aren't taking part in any kind of activity, your mind isn't occupied, so it often wanders. This leads it into dark territory. And since all there is to hear is the sound of your own breathing and the mattress as it creaks when you shift, your mind can't help but imagine the most terrifying possibility that could disrupt this silence. And as your body becomes more and more exhausted, your brain becomes more and more restless. You automatically realize that you are letting your guard down, and it's not a stuffed animal falling down that would break the silence, but a monster screaming about to bite your limbs off, waiting in the very same room with you, 2 inches from your face, and you can't even see it because you're in the dark. It's waiting to get you in the vulnerable state, hiding in the shadows that you provide for it. But Dylan was well prepared when he slept by himself for the first time. He was armed with a goldfish nightlight to rid his room of all the hiding places for monsters to be. He also, of course, had bedspread. Now, everyone with a pulse knows that the best form of protection from the paranormal is to hide under the covers. A blanket, even a sheet will do. It's true. It must be true because nobody tells a kid about this. It hasn't been established anywhere. But it's a universal fact that kids just acquire. We instinctually feel safer under the covers. It doesn't make sense, but then again, monsters don't really make sense either. Maybe there's some sort of holy magic that grows within the fibers of the blankets that they add at the blanket factories. Or maybe it uses the same tactics as the monsters. The monsters hide in the dark, so we can't see them. So it's only fair that we can hide under our blankets so they won't be able to see us. So Dylan spent every night looking at the little light his goldfish nightlight provided through the race car pattern on his sheets. With that, he was able to get through his teen years, until he was 15 and traded his race car for some plaid and his goldfish for a boring yellow square. Every couple of weeks, of course, he would have to sleep with his parents, when his mind would get a little too creative, and in the uncomfortable silence, he couldn't help but imagine how petrifying it would be if a winged man creature with no eyes would cut his head off and leave the skin. He somehow managed to get through his childhood without scaring himself to death. He managed to get through his teen years, though sleepovers were tough because they happened in unfamiliar places. Sometimes they didn't even have night lights. But he was surrounded by people, so he would be okay. And when all else failed, he could always put the blanket over his head. And he would always be okay. He got through college just fine. His roommate was a friend from high school, so there was no initial fear at the beginning that he might be a serial killer or a cannibal. Finally, it was time for Dylan to spend his first night in the house he'd just bought for himself. He worked in product design and had gotten a house right near a company that recently hired him. He'd been working there for a few days now from a bad commute. But now he'd finally be able to drive 2 minutes instead of 2 hours to get to the building. It was especially bad because it was January, so snow was clogging up the roads. But first, he'd have to get through this first night here. Oh, he knew it was going to be a bad night. On top of living by himself for the first time, none of his family or friends lived around here, so he was completely alone and stranded. There was no one to ease his nerves, to protect him, to not make his house seem so dead. He barely started to unpack, so the house didn't even feel like it was his yet. But the house was his, so he was just going to have to get used to that. Dylan sighed to himself in his black t-shirt and sweatpants. He was digging around in some boxes for the yellow nightlight he hadn't used in years. God, Dylan, you're 28 years old now. You don't need a nightlight, god damn it. But it couldn't hurt to plug it in, just in case. He could just turn it on later if he really wanted. And the outlet was right next to his bed, so he could reach it without even moving. And so he plugged it in, and immediately jumped into bed after turning off the ceiling light and inviting the darkness to invade his room. He made sure to face the door. You always have to face the door when you're sleeping, or else a paranormal entity could float right through the doorway and kill you before you can even get the chance to see it and run away. With nothing to look at in the dark, no sounds to capture his attention, Dylan's mind was able to wander. And since he was living in a new house, it was able to wander far. What even happened in this house? Could someone have gotten murdered here years ago? What if the previous owners used the place for satanic rituals? What if the demons they summoned were still here, lurking in every corner? Stop it, Dylan, stop! He suddenly got the urge to go under the covers, head and all. No, don't do that. He'd be a scaredy cat. He'd have to get used to this place eventually. But what if the demons took him and brought him to this alternate dimension where time stops moving? Is that what death feels like? Is this what death feels like? Laying in complete darkness, waiting for a new day to come. But the more time passes, the farther away the new day gets. You know, Dylan would actually be rather comfortable with his head under the covers. Yeah, it was only January, and he was using just a small electric heater because his heater wasn't hooked up yet. His face was significantly colder than the rest of him, so why not just stick your head under the covers for a while? No! No. Don't give in. Think about which boxes you want to unpack tomorrow, Dylan. Oh, God. The boxes. Who knows what kind of evil creature could be hiding in a box, destroying his belongings, ready to claw his eyes out when discovered? Or what if some totally normal animal managed to find its way into a box and die, and now its corpse is just rotting, crammed in between the computer speakers and the radio? And, oh man, if some kind of monster was in his house, it would make a hell of a lot of noise if it knocked over a box. Because if a box fell over, it would obviously be because a monster pushed it over. Suddenly, the electric heater crackled. Shit! Dylan immediately threw his covers over his head. He felt safer, like the blankets provided a protective field. Ugh, man, get over yourself, Dylan. Your girlfriend would be laughing hysterically if she could see you right now. Dylan held his breath and reluctantly peeked above the blankets. It must be late by now. He had work in the morning, so he would have to get over his fears and get some sleep so he could be well rested for tomorrow. He crept his face out of the blankets, exposing it to the cold. and turned to look at the clock. Oh man, if he fell asleep now, he'd only be getting about 4 hours worth. Just think about your girlfriend. That'll distract you. And don't forget to face the door. Dylan flipped over so he was back facing the door again. Your girlfriend. You're so lucky to have her. She was so understanding about you moving away. She wants the best for you. Oh, and remember the other day when she told you that joke about the 3 cats that walked into a bar? It was frickin' hilarious. She was so clever like that. And then her nose wrinkled the way it always did when she laughed in that cute way. Oh, and this next part would occupy Dylan's mind for a while. She had the sweetest, sexiest, roundest... Suddenly, Dylan's brain shut down as the door curled open, emanating a painfully drawn-out creaking sound. Shit, fuck! What the hell was that? A muffled squeak came from Dylan as he buried his head back under the blankets. He tucked his knees under his chin and clenched his legs and his arms in a tight fetal position. It was a ghost. It was a monster. A demon! It was going to kill him! It was... Dylan's heart exploded in his ears, and his body began to elicit a cold, sticky sweat. No. This was his first night in this house. Maybe the hinges were loose. Maybe the door just opened by itself. Yeah, maybe the doors opened by themselves here. Dylan felt the warmth of the blankets around him like the safety of a mother's womb. He felt the calming texture of cloth against the flesh of his face, as if it were a kind hand stroking him. His heartbeat began to simmer. Dylan let out a hollow sigh. The covers were fulfilling their duty as a protective force field that would triumph over all evil. However, as I mentioned before, anyone with a pulse knows that under the covers are the safest place, in addition to others without a pulse. Dylan's brain stopped functioning as he heard a tiny, little voice whisper in his ear. "This is where I used to hide when I was alive." Dylan's jaw sprung open to scream, but only a shrill cough could escape his lungs. He leapt out of bed, limbs flailing, and fell on the floor, creating a noise that startled him even more. He sat there a few seconds, chest heaving unsteadily, hands trembling, eyes burning in the dark. Maybe he could call a friend and sleep over? No, he didn't know anyone in the area that well, and his friends back home wouldn't believe him. But he heard a fucking voice, clear as day. He was trapped here with the fucking demon, and he scrunched up his body with his head on his knees, waiting for death to come, waiting to get decapitated, waiting to get strangled, waiting to be thrown across the room. But alas, nothing happened. Maybe you just imagined it, Dylan, you little motherfucker. You hallucinated the voice, that was all. Your fears got the best of you. It wasn't real. Great. And if you fall asleep now, you still wouldn't be getting more than 2 hours worth. So he'd try to get back to bed. He cautiously got up, fingers twitching. It couldn't hurt to put on the nightlight now. In the light, he could just pick an object in the room and stare at it until he fell asleep. Yeah, that'd work. He crawled into bed and did not go under the covers at all this time, despite how cold it was. He was not willing to risk hearing another voice coming from under there. He let his arm creep to the wall to find his nightlight. He hoped there were no demons to tear it off as his hand got closer and closer to the underside of his bed, where monsters love to come up. Maybe now he would be able to fall asleep. He sure was tired by now. He shivered and his body calmed down a bit more. His fingers found the switch and he turned the nightlight on. As the blue tones of the wall were revealed, so was an unfamiliar silhouette, and it was no box to be unpacked. The shape of a man was illuminated. Dylan nearly swallowed his tongue as the ominous figure came into view. This man didn't look right. His head was slouched down and his arms seemed crooked. The sound of the heater grew louder and louder, screaming in Dylan's ears. He just stared at this thing in his room, so hard it felt like his eyelids would split open. He couldn't even tell if the thing was staring back because its face was concealed in shadow. Dylan felt like a fist was around his lungs, and the grip was getting tighter and tighter. Dylan shivered in the cold. Fuck! The thing abruptly turned its head. Dylan tasted blood and didn't even realize it was from his tongue that he had clenched his teeth down on. But that's okay, because he didn't care about it anyway. It was so cold, though. Tiny plug-in heaters are only so effective, you know. But the thing just stood there, its presence looming over him like a dark thundercloud before the storm. It made him feel even colder. He couldn't go under the covers again, not after hearing that voice. But those arms... They didn't go straight down like arms should, they curved almost at the thing's sides. It had its hands pleasantly folded. As Dylan blinked, he felt his eyelids stumble over the dried spheres his eyeballs were becoming. This thing had been standing here, motionless for a while, and Dylan's body was becoming tense from holding back more shivers. His jaw was held tight, as well as his fists, and his legs trembled as the freezing air tickled his skin as his fears danced within him. Dylan watched the thing slowly turn its head more as he tucked himself under the covers so that only his head stuck out. He was careful to do this as smoothly and slowly as possible, so as to not cause any creaking from the mattress. The tension in Dylan's body began to melt as it absorbed the blanket's heat. Maybe the covers did have magic. Yeah, of protection. And with his head nestled neatly outside, he wouldn't be able to hear any voices from inside. But Dylan watched, more horrified than ever, as the thing began to really move. Its arms lurched in different directions, and Dylan realized it was reaching down to the floor. He saw that the arms had 3 joints instead of 2. One extra between the wrist and the elbow. The creature got lower and lower with the slyness of a snake, creeping and twisting its body to fit the contours of the earth and rock it squeezes between. Finally, Dylan could only see the top of its head and shoulders as it got in a crouching position. He stared as what he could see of the creature began to travel closer and closer to his bed, like a shark fin lurking above water. He could hear the bones twist and crack, all gnarled and wood-like as the thing switched its weight from the right arm to the left. And the shoulder of the arm that the weight was not on shot so very uncomfortably high in the air. The thing was so clumsy and lopsided like a marionette, but its movements were so fluid. By now, it was right next to the side of the bed. Dylan could only pray and feel the warmth and comfort of the covers around his ears and neck. His body was spread out and vulnerable under his blankets, how a performer might lay on a knife-throwing spinning wheel. Suddenly, the creature began to rise. It was as if the puppet master pulled this thing's strings up, and Dylan still couldn't even tell just what the thing's face looked like. But he was able to notice the smell that could have been nothing other than decaying flesh. It let out a whispery grunt, the way air might sound if it traveled through dead lungs. The thing began to unwind the joints in its arms, one joint at a time. Snap, crackle, pop. Slowly, it leaned over Dylan, and he felt one hand grab his covers on one side of his head, and the other hand grab covers on the other side. Something fell. He guessed from the creature's flesh, and it landed right onto Dylan's face, so it was moist and gritty, and it slid down to his neck. Then the thing pulled the covers in opposite directions so that they put more and more pressure on his neck. It was discovered that 3 deaths took place in that room. Dylan Benson was found choked to death in bed with the covers up to his chin. The second occurred years before, when a little girl was stabbed to death in bed. The third happened moments after the second, when the girl's killer was shot, twice in the chest and once in each arm. You know how children are afraid when they have to go to sleep? There is a reason.